Canada just made a move that could reshape the global critical minerals map, and Washington is paying attention. On March 12, 2026, Prime Minister Mark Carney stood in Yellowknife, the heart of Canada's Northwest Territories, and announced a $40 billion plan to defend and transform Canada's Arctic on the surface. It looked like a defense announcement: forward operating bases, radar upgrades, Arctic airfields, but buried inside that plan was something that sent shockwaves through Washington's defense and technology sectors. Canada is deliberately building the infrastructure to route its Arctic mineral wealth, rare earths, lithium, nickel, cobalt, to global markets, not American markets, global markets, and Canada has already started. Before we break this down, drop a comment right now. Where are you watching from? The US? Canada? Europe? Asia? Because what Carney just set in motion affects everyone differently, and I want to know who's on the other side of this screen. Here's what actually happened and why it matters more than the headlines suggest. Carney's March 12th announcement was not just about military bases. The plan, backed by over $35 billion in federal investment, is explicitly designed to accomplish three things simultaneously: defend Canada's Arctic sovereignty, develop its critical mineral deposits, and build the trade corridors to get those minerals to global buyers. The phrase Carney used was stark. Canada is moving from reliance to resilience. We will no longer depend on any one nation. That single line is the economic earthquake underneath the defense headlines. Canada has historically exported the overwhelming majority of its resources, energy, minerals, raw materials, to the United States. Carney just announced that era is ending. Canada is building the ports, roads, and pipelines to reach Europe and Asia directly. His government had already been moving in this direction. Canada's stated goal is to double exports to non-US markets within a decade. The March 12th Arctic Plan is the infrastructure backbone of that goal. And at the center of it all is the Canadian Arctic's mineral wealth that the United States has long assumed would naturally flow south, because geography and alliance made it the obvious buyer. Carney just announced that assumption was wrong. Let me walk you through what's actually at stake in the Canadian Arctic, because the numbers are real even if the drama is understated. The Canadian Arctic, defined as territories north of 60 latitude, including Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut, contains some of the world's largest undeveloped deposits of critical and strategic minerals. Geological surveys estimate the total recoverable value in the hundreds of billions of dollars based on known deposits and current prices. Category 1: Rare earth elements. The Canadian Arctic contains significant rare earth deposits: neodymium, dysprosium, terbium, essential for permanent magnets used in electric motors, wind turbines, guided missiles, and fighter jet systems. China currently controls approximately 85% of global rare earth production and refining. Canadian Arctic rare earths represent one of the few non-Chinese sources in existence. Category 2: Lithium and battery metals. The Canadian Arctic contains lithium, cobalt, and nickel deposits essential for lithium-ion batteries powering electric vehicles, grid storage, and electronics. Canada's federal government has already mobilized $18.5 billion in critical minerals projects with 12 allied partners, including investment from European, Japanese, and Korean entities specifically. Targeting battery supply chains. Category 3: Precious metals: gold, silver, platinum, palladium, and rhodium used in catalytic converters, fuel cells, and electronics, with Canada now building export infrastructure to reach global buyers directly. Category 4: Base metals and industrial minerals: copper, zinc, iron, or less. Strategically critical individually, but substantial in aggregate, and all now in the crosshairs of Canada's diversification agenda. Subscribe right now, because what I'm about to show you is what Canada has already done to replace us buyers, and why Washington's defense establishment is taking this seriously. And the partnerships are already being built. Canada has secured 30 new critical minerals partnerships, mobilizing $18.5 billion in investment from 12 allied nations: Japan, South Korea, European Union members, Australia, and Nordic countries among them. These are real agreements involving real capital commitments to develop Canadian Arctic mineral deposits and route the output to allied markets. Canada signed a new security and defense partnership with the European Union. Germany deployed a naval vessel to the Arctic for the first time as part of a joint operation. Norway and Canada deepened cooperation specifically around Arctic defense and critical minerals. Japan and South Korea, whose battery manufacturing industries are in direct competition with US firms for critical mineral supply, are among the invested partners. The $35 billion in federal Arctic investment funds the roads, ports, and airfields that make it physically possible to export Canadian Arctic minerals to Europe and Asia, routes that previously didn't have the infrastructure to be viable. Canada is not threatening to cut off the U.S. It's doing something more consequential. It's building the infrastructure to not need the U.S. as a buyer at all. Here's what happened in Washington when Carney's Arctic plan landed. The U.S. Department of Defense has been tracking Canada's critical mineral realignment with documented concern. Pentagon officials have consistently flagged the risk of losing access to Canadian rare earth deposits, currently one of the few non-Chinese sources for materials essential to U.S. weapon systems. In congressional testimony and defense planning documents, officials have described Canadian critical minerals as strategically irreplaceable in the near term. If Canada's Arctic infrastructure routes rare earths to European and Asian buyers, first locking in supply contracts before U.S. companies can compete, the U.S. faces a narrowing window in which Canadian materials are competitively accessible. That's not a hypothetical. That's the explicit logic of Canada's diversification strategy. At the Department of Energy level, the concern mirrors the defense problem but applies to battery metals. The U.S. is attempting to build a domestic electric vehicle industry competitive with China's, and that effort requires secure supplies of lithium, cobalt, and nickel. As Canada builds export infrastructure to Japan and South Korea, the U.S. faces a structural supply chain disadvantage that takes a decade to reverse through domestic mining development. Trump's response to Canada's Arctic pivot has been reactive rather than strategic. The White House has framed Canada's trade diversification as economic coercion, arguing that geographic proximity and historical partnership entitle American companies to preferential access to Canadian exports after Carney's election win in April 2025. Trump escalated tariffs on Canadian goods, arguing economic pressure would force Canada back into alignment. It had the opposite effect. Carney's government cited U.S. tariffs explicitly as the reason for accelerating diversification. Canada's response to U.S. economic pressure would not be capitulation, it would be restructuring. The March 12th Arctic Plan is the most concrete expression of that posture. Canada is not asking for permission to sell minerals to Europe and Asia. It is building the infrastructure to make that the default, regardless of what Washington does next. The White House has called Canada's trade pivots irrational and punitive. Canada has called them resilience. The congressional reaction has been bipartisan and alarmed. Senate Energy and Defense Committees have held multiple hearings on critical mineral supply chain vulnerability. The consistent finding: the U.S. is strategically dependent on foreign sources for rare earths, lithium, and cobalt, and Canada has historically been the most reliable allied supplier. US defense contractors have documented the concern publicly. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman have each stated in public disclosures and congressional testimony that rare earth materials are critical to F-35 production, missile systems, and advanced electronics, with Canadian deposits cited as the primary available alternative to Chinese supply. Tesla and other U.S. electric vehicle manufacturers face a parallel problem. Battery metal supply chains are tightening globally as EV demand accelerates. Canada's Critical Minerals Production Alliance is routing billions in investment to allied battery manufacturers in Japan and South Korea. CV manufacturers compete for the same raw materials without the same investment partnerships. Carney has been direct about what Canada's Arctic investment means for the U.S. relationship. In multiple press conferences and public statements, Carney has articulated a consistent position. Canada's resources are Canadian sovereign assets. The era of assuming the United States is the automatic buyer for Canadian exports is over. Canada's goal is to become an energy and mineral superpower, not a resource dependency of its southern neighbor. That framing is deliberate. Carney has specifically invoked Canada's resource sovereignty in the context of Trump's threats to make Canada the 51st state, his tariff regime, and his broader posture toward Canadian sovereignty. The message Canada is sending is structural. Even if the political relationship with the U.S. improves, the infrastructure being built now will route minerals and energy toward global markets permanently. The deep-water ports, the Arctic roads, the allied supply agreements, those don't disappear when a new administration arrives in Washington. Canada is not positioning this as punishment. It's positioning it as economic independence. The distinction matters, but for American supply chain planners, the outcome is the same. Canada's allied partners have responded with enthusiasm and capital. The European Union signed a new security and defense partnership with Canada, with Arctic mineral access explicitly part of the strategic framework. European Commission officials have described Canada's critical minerals as essential to European strategic autonomy. reducing EU dependence on Chinese rare earths for defense and clean energy manufacturing. Germany's first-ever Arctic naval deployment underlines that Europe is treating this as a strategic priority, not a trade preference. Japan and South Korea have committed investment capital through Canada's Critical Minerals Production Alliance, specifically for battery metal development, because Japanese and Korean battery manufacturers need secure lithium, cobalt, and nickel supplies to compete with Chinese EV manufacturers. And then there's China's reaction, which raised the most significant concern in Washington. China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs noted Canada's mineral diversification and stated plainly, China remains the world's primary supplier of rare earth elements and is ready to meet global demand. The implication was not subtle. Beijing already suspended gallium and germanium exports to the U.S. in late 2024 in response to chip sector restrictions. The same playbook is available for rare earths, and if the U.S. cannot access Canadian sources because allied buyers contracted for them first, China is the remaining option. Let me give you 3 scenarios for us access to critical minerals as Canada's Arctic infrastructure comes online. Scenario 1, expensive alternatives. The U.S. negotiates mineral access from Australia, select African nations, and limited domestic sources. These alternatives cost more and deliver less reliability. U.S. defense contractors and technology companies absorb 25 to 35% higher materials costs. The defense industrial base remains functional but weakened competitively. Scenario 2, Chinese dependence. Unable to secure adequate alternatives quickly enough, the U.S. becomes increasingly reliant on China for rare earths and battery metals. By 2030, the U.S. faces impossible choices: moderate its China policy, or accept supply constraints on materials essential to both its defense posture and its clean energy transition. Scenario 3, strategic initiative. The U.S. launches a major domestic rare earth and lithium development program, potentially $100 to $200 billion. Over a decade, by the mid-2030s, the U.S. achieves meaningful self-sufficiency. But the intervening decade is marked by shortages, elevated costs, and reduced competitiveness, and by the time the U.S. gets there, European and Asian manufacturers supplied by Canadian Arctic minerals have captured markets the U.S. once dominated. Here's where we stand. Carney announced $40 billion in Arctic investment, not just for defense, but to build the trade corridors and export infrastructure to route Canadian critical minerals to global markets. Canada has already secured $18.5 billion in allied investment. The partnerships are with Europe, Japan, South Korea, and Nordic nations. The U.S. is not the priority buyer. The infrastructure being built now, deepwater Arctic ports, all-season mineral corridors, allied supply agreements will determine who gets Canadian rare earths, lithium, and cobalt for the next generation. The defense contractors who need rare earths for missiles and fighter jets, and the EV manufacturers who need battery metals to compete with China are now competing in a global market for materials. Canada is routing 2 allies who showed up with investment capital and strategic partnerships. The minerals are real, the infrastructure is under construction, and Canada's sovereign right to choose its buyers is exactly the leverage Carney said it was. Share this video if it brought you value. Subscribe to stay ahead of the next move, because this story is not finished.